If you're listening to this, I want you to understand something from the start. Disappearances don't always happen loudly. There's no slammed door. No dramatic note on the kitchen counter. No final phone call. Sometimes, the person you love most just stops existing in your life. That's what happened with my wife. I came home from work on a Tuesday evening, later than usual, and the house felt wrong before I even opened my mouth. Not quiet, wrong star. Like when you walk into a room and realize a conversation just ended, and you weren't meant to hear it. Her shoes weren't by the door. Her car wasn't in the driveway. Her phone wasn't charging on the counter where she always left it. I called her name once. Then again. Nothing. At first, I told myself I was overreacting. She probably went out. Maybe she forgot to text. Maybe her phone died. All the normal lies you tell yourself when you're not ready to imagine something worse. But by midnight, I was sitting on the couch, staring at the dark TV screen, replaying every conversation we'd had over the last month. Every argument. Every silence. And the terrifying realization started to creep in. She didn't just leave the house. She left me. The last time I saw my wife, there was nothing dramatic about it. That's the part that still messes with my head. She was standing in the kitchen, hair tied back, wearing one of my old shirts. She was packing our daughter's lunch for school, humming quietly. I kissed her cheek. She smiled. Not a fake smile. A real one. "Don't forget the permission slip," she said. I didn't. We talked about groceries. About bills. About nothing important. If someone had told me that would be the last normal moment of my marriage, I would have laughed in their face. Because things weren't perfect, but they weren't broken either. Or at least, that's what I thought. We'd been together 12 years. Married 9. 1 kid. A house we could borrow. Or so I believed. What I didn't know was that stability can be an illusion maintained by someone who's been lying for years. By the third day, panic had replaced denial. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her social media was untouched. Her sister hadn't heard from her. Neither had her best friend. Neither had her mother. I called hospitals. Police stations. I filed a missing person report, feeling ridiculous and desperate at the same time. The officer asked the questions calmly, methodically. "Any history of mental health issues?" "No." "Any recent fights?" "Nothing unusual." "Any chance she left voluntarily?" That one stuck in my throat. "I don't think so," I said. And I meant it. They told me adults are allowed to disappear. They told me to wait. So I waited. I barely slept. I barely ate. I watched our daughter like a hawk, terrified she noticed something I didn't know how to explain. Every knock at the door made my heart jump. Every unknown number felt like it could change everything. But nothing came. Just silence. It was her laptop that broke everything open. I wasn't snooping at first. I was looking for a document, insurance information, something practical. Her browser was already open. And there it was. An email draft. Not sent. Not deleted. Just sitting there, waiting. It wasn't long. No dramatic goodbye. No apology. It said, "I can't keep lying. I don't know how to leave without destroying everyone. I'm so tired, I read it over and over, my hands shaking. Lying about what? Destroying who? That was the moment my fear changed shape. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a breakdown. This was a choice. And I had no idea what she had chosen over us. I found his name a week later. It was buried deep in her messages, under a contact saved as a coworker. Generic. Safe. Easy to overlook. But the messages weren't professional. "I miss you. I hate sneaking around. I don't know how much longer I can do this." My stomach dropped. The timestamps told a story I wasn't ready to accept. This wasn't new. This wasn't a mistake. This was years. Years of lunches that ran late. business trips that didn't add up, mood swings I blamed on stress. And suddenly, her disappearance wasn't a mystery. It was an escape. Once you know, you start seeing everything differently. Every argument where she accused me of not being present. Every time she pulled away when I touched her. Every moment she said she needed space. It wasn't space. It was guilt. And when I realized how long she'd been living a double life, something inside me broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a rewrite of our entire marriage. Our daughter asked me where her mom was. I didn't know what to say. I told her mommy was taking time to figure things out. That she loved her. That she'd be back. Every lie tasted like metal in my mouth. She started sleeping with the light on. Started asking if I was going to disappear too. That's when anger finally replaced shock. Because whatever my wife had been running from, whatever life she'd chosen, it came at a cost. And she let our child pay it. 3 weeks after she vanished, I finally got the truth. Not from her. From the man she'd been hiding. His wife found out. And when she did, everything collapsed. She called me. Calm. Controlled. Furious. She told me everything. The affair. The timeline. The plans my wife had been making. Including the one part that still makes my hands shake. She wasn't coming back. Not to me. Not to our daughter. Not to the life she'd built. She had already chosen. Chapter 9. The choice that ends a marriage. When my wife finally called, her voice was flat. She didn't apologize. She didn't? 12 years reduced to 5 words. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I didn't ask questions. Because by then, I already knew the answers. And some truths, once revealed, make reconciliation impossible. Chapter 10. Aftermath. Divorce isn't one moment. It's 1,000 small losses. It's signing papers you never imagined. Explaining absences you didn't create. Rebuilding trust you didn't break. My wife disappeared once. But what she left behind was permanent. This story doesn't end with closure. It ends with acceptance. Some people don't leave to be found. They leave because they're done being who you believe they were. And learning to live with that truth. That's the part nobody warns you about. After that phone call, the house stopped feeling like a home. It felt like a crime scene I was still living inside. Every object suddenly meant something different. Her coffee mug. Her sweater draped over the chair. The picture frame on the hallway wall where we were smiling too hard, like people trying to convince themselves. I didn't throw anything away. Not because I wanted to keep it, but because I didn't know what belonged to me anymore. At night, I walked through the rooms like I was trespassing. I opened closets I already knew were empty. I checked drawers even after I accepted she wasn't coming back. Part of me was still waiting for the sound of keys in the door. Another part of me hoped I'd never hear them again. Her mother stopped answering my calls first. Then her sister. Then everyone. It happened slowly enough that I almost missed it. Messages left unread. Calls going to voicemail. Polite responses replaced with silence. At first I assumed grief. Confusion. Shock. Then I realized something darker. They knew more than I did. I finally caught her sister on the phone one afternoon. Her voice was tight, defensive. She needed to leave, she said. From what? I asked. A pause. From everything. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just my wife disappearing. This was a coordinated exit. They weren't surprised. They weren't searching. They were protecting. And that hurt almost as much as what she'd done. The second time she called, it was because she needed something. That should have told me everything. I need my documents, she said. Birth certificate. Passport. I asked her where she was. She didn't answer. I asked her if she'd spoken to our daughter. Another pause. She'll understand someday. Something in me snapped. No, I said quietly. She won't. Silence. And then the line went dead. That was the moment I stopped hoping. I met him by accident. Or maybe inevitability. I was at a grocery store 3 towns over, the kind you only go to when you're trying not to run into anyone who knows you. I heard her laugh before I saw her. That same laugh. The one I thought was ours. She was standing beside him, hand on his arm, like she'd been doing it forever. He looked ordinary. That's what scared me. Not charming. Not powerful. Just another man who had decided his wants mattered more than the wreckage he caused. She froze when she saw me. He didn't. He smiled. I left my card right there and walked out. I didn't trust myself to stay. People think infidelity is about sex. It's not. It's about narrative control. She didn't just cheat, she rewrote our history to justify it. She painted herself as trapped. Me as absent. Our marriage as a mistake that needed correcting. And the longer she told that story, the more she believed it. By the time she left, she wasn't betraying me anymore. She was saving herself, at least that's how she saw it. And once someone believes that, there's no room left for accountability. Kids don't ask the questions you prepare for. They ask the ones you're afraid of. Did Mommy leave because of me? That one almost dropped me to my knees. No, I said immediately. Never. But she didn't say goodbye. I had no answer. She started drawing pictures without her mom in them. Started referring to our house as your house instead of our house. Loss teaches children language they shouldn't have yet. And I hated my wife for that more than anything else. The full truth didn't come all at once. It never does. It came through overheard conversations. Court paperwork. Loose comments from people who thought I already knew. The affair hadn't been years. It had been almost the entire marriage. The job change she pushed for. The move closer to his city. This wasn't impulsive. It was strategic. And realizing that hurt in a way I didn't have words for. Divorce is cold. Forms. Deadlines. Custody schedules. The emotional wreckage gets compressed into checkboxes. I learned how to speak about my marriage like a legal entity instead of a life. I learned how to explain betrayal without sounding bitter, because bitterness is often used against you. I learned how to sit across from someone who used to be my wife and speak only when necessary. No tears. No anger. Just distance. And distance, I learned, is its own kind of grief. It came late. Too late. She said it like a request? Like something I could grant if I was generous enough. I didn't mean to hurt you. I almost laughed. Intent doesn't erase impact. I believe you, I said. But that doesn't change anything. She looked surprised. People who betray often expect absolution. They don't expect boundaries. Time didn't heal everything. But it clarified. I stopped imagining her return. Stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I focused on routines. On my daughter. On rebuilding something stable from the ruins. And slowly, without noticing at first, her absence stopped being the loudest thing in the room. That scared me. Because it meant I was moving on. And there's guilt in that too. She left to start over. I stayed to rebuild. That's the difference. Some people disappear to escape consequences. Others stay and face them. My marriage ended the day she vanished. But my life didn't. And that's the part she never planned for. Courtrooms don't look dramatic in real life. They're beige. Too clean. Too quiet. No music. No tension you can point to. Just people pretending the decisions they're making won't permanently alter other people's lives. I sat at the table with my attorney while my wife sat across from me like a stranger I vaguely recognized. She didn't look ashamed. She didn't look relieved either. She looked focused. Like this was a task she intended to complete. When custody was discussed, she asked for shared weekends. Not full custody. Not primary. Just enough to look like a mother. I watched her speak about our daughter like a responsibility she still wanted credit for, but not the work. That was when something inside me hardened. The judge asked her why she left without notice. She hesitated. Then she said, "I was afraid." Afraid of what? She didn't say. She didn't mention abuse. Or threats. Or danger. Just fear. And somehow, that vague word hung in the room like smoke. I realized then how easily truth can be bent without technically lying. Fear of accountability. Fear of being seen. Fear of choosing comfort over responsibility. Fear doesn't justify disappearance. But it sounds good in court. Her mother called me that night. Not to apologize. To explain. She was unhappy for a long time, she said. I almost asked how long I was supposed to know that. Almost. Instead, I listened. They'd known about the affair. Not the details. Not the timeline. But enough. Enough to excuse it. Enough to help her plan an exit. Enough to protect her instead of their granddaughter. That was when I understood something important. Betrayal doesn't survive alone. It requires witnesses willing to stay silent. Kids listen. Even when you think they're distracted. Even when you lower your voice. One night my daughter asked, "Is Mommy with another man?" I froze. Grandma said Mommy is happier now. Happier. I realized then how dangerous half-truths are when fed to children. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. I told her, "Mommy made choices that hurt people. That doesn't mean she doesn't love you." She nodded. But something changed in her eyes. Children don't forget emotional math. The first weekend visit was worse than the disappearance. I packed her bag. Labeled her clothes. Made lists. My daughter stood by the door, not crying, just stiff. When my wife arrived, she knelt and hugged her like everything was normal. My daughter hugged her back politely. Not desperately. Not eagerly. Politely. That broke me more than tears would have. I learned they moved in together. Not from her. From paperwork. Joint address. Utility bills. She hadn't disappeared. She'd relocated. Built a new life on the bones of the old one. And suddenly, I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. Months passed. She tried to rewrite the story during exchanges. We just grew apart. We wanted different things. It wasn't working. I stopped correcting her. People committed to a lie don't want clarity. They want validation. And I wasn't offering it anymore. The irony came quietly. He cheated on her. I found out because she showed up unannounced, crying, shaking. She wanted comfort. Closure. Understanding. I gave her water. And distance. What did you expect? I asked, not cruelly, honestly. She didn't answer. Some lessons can't be softened. The last real conversation we had wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No tears. Just truth. I ruined this, she said. Yes, I replied. I didn't mean. I know. But. There is no but. She looked at me like someone realizing too late that a door doesn't reopen just because you regret walking through it. Years passed. She started building something new with me instead. My wife became a background figure. A scheduled presence. No longer central. No longer powerful. Just someone who made choices and lived with them. People ask if I'd take her back. The answer is simple. No. Because disappearance is a line you don't uncross. Some choices don't end relationships. They redefine reality. And once you've lived in that new reality long enough, going back feels impossible. This story doesn't end with forgiveness. It ends with acceptance. She disappeared. I stayed. And that difference shaped everything. There's a version of me that didn't make it through all this. The man who believed love meant safety. The man who assumed loyalty was default. The man who thought disappearance required desperation or madness. That version of me died quietly somewhere between court dates and custody exchanges. What replaced him wasn't colder, just sharper. I learned to listen differently. To trust patterns over promises. To accept that some people don't implode when they leave, they calculate. And once you see that, you don't unsee it. My wife didn't vanish anymore. She faded. Missed a pickup because she forgot. Cancelled weekends because she was overwhelmed. Called less. Asked fewer questions. At first, I documented everything out of fear. Then I stopped. Because the truth became obvious. She hadn't disappeared once. She was disappearing slowly, deliberately, in a way that let her feel less guilty. And my daughter noticed before I did. That was the question. Not where is she? Not when will she come back? Why does she keep leaving? I didn't have a comforting answer. So I gave her an honest one. Some adults don't know how to stay, I said. That doesn't mean you aren't worth staying for. She nodded like she understood. Kids shouldn't have to understand that. It happened during a parent-teacher conference. The teacher mentioned behavior changes during visits with her mom. Withdrawal. Irritability. Confusion. She asked gently, "Is everything stable on both sides?" I opened my mouth to defend my wife. Then I closed it. "No," I said. "It's not." That was the first time I told the truth without cushioning it. And it felt like relief. She called late one night. Said she was thinking about the past. About mistakes. About how things got out of control. She said, "We both played a part." That's when I knew there would never be peace between us. Silence. "You made choices," I continued. "I lived with the consequences. That's not shared responsibility." She hung up. And I didn't call back. Her life didn't collapse dramatically. It thinned. Friends drifted. Trust eroded. Relationships ended the way ours had, quietly, evasively, without accountability. She became someone people didn't rely on. Someone people didn't expect to stay. I didn't celebrate that. But I noticed it. Actions echo longer than apologies. She was 13 when it happened. Old enough to understand patterns. Young enough to still hope. Her mother forgot her birthday. Not maliciously. Just forgot. My daughter didn't cry. She just said, "I don't want to go this weekend." I didn't argue. And that was the moment custody schedules stopped mattering. Letting go wasn't a speech. It was paperwork. Unanswered messages. Longer gaps between contact. Eventually, months passed without hearing from her. Then years. And one day, I realized I hadn't thought about her at all. Not with anger. Not with sadness. Just absence. People ask how it ended. It didn't. It expired. Relationships don't always explode. Some just stop being fed. My wife disappeared once, and then spent years proving she never really came back. When people hear my story, they ask the wrong question. They ask, "Did she cheat?" Yes. But that wasn't the ending. The ending was this. She chose herself at the cost of everyone else. And then she kept choosing that, over and over, until there was nothing left to choose. My daughter grew into herself. Confident. Observant. Careful with her heart. She learned early that love without consistency is noise. And I learned that staying, really staying, is an act of courage most people don't talk about. My wife disappeared. 3 weeks later, I found out why. Others leave because they don't know how to live with the damage they've already done. This story doesn't end with closure. It ends with permanence. She left. We stayed. And that difference wrote the rest of our lives. What people don't tell you is that the real damage doesn't peak when someone leaves. It peaks later. It peaks when life goes quiet again, and there's no crisis left to distract you. When there are no court dates, no urgent phone calls, no paperwork demanding your attention. Just days. Weeks. Years. And the knowledge that this is your life now. I settled into routines because routines were safer than reflection. Mornings became mechanical. Breakfast. School drop-off. Work. Dinner. Homework. Lights out. At night, after my daughter fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room with the lights off, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, replaying moments I hadn't questioned enough when they were happening. The way my wife used to pull away slightly when I touched her. The way she framed every conflict as my failure to understand her. The way she spoke about wanting more, without ever defining what that meant. I used to think those were signs of emotional depth. Now I recognize them as distance. And distance, when sustained long enough, becomes preparation. People love the word closure. They say it like it's something another person can hand you if they're decent enough. Like a final conversation. A confession. An apology. That's not how it works. Closure isn't given. It's extracted. Sometimes violently. I didn't get an explanation that made sense. I didn't get a moment where everything aligned and I finally understood her. What I got instead was repetition. She repeated the same behaviors with different people. She repeated the same excuses with different voices. She repeated the same disappearances in smaller, quieter ways. And eventually, the pattern became. Some people don't leave because of who you are. They leave because staying requires accountability they can't survive. The cost didn't show up all at once. It arrived in pieces. A call from a school counselor asking if everything was okay at home. A teacher mentioning my daughter seemed hyper-aware of adults' moods. A doctor suggesting anxiety wasn't uncommon in children who experienced abandonment. Abandonment. That word hit harder than cheating ever did. Cheating was about me. Abandonment was about her child. And once I accepted that truth, something inside me closed permanently. There are betrayals you can contextualize. This wasn't one of them. It surprised me when it happened. No announcement. No dramatic shift. I was folding laundry one afternoon, pairing socks, when I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not tired angry. Not suppressed angry. Just finished. Anger requires engagement. It requires imagination. It requires you to still believe the other person matters enough to deserve your emotional energy. She didn't. That realization didn't feel like victory. It felt like amputation. Necessary. Clean. Final. Years later, she reached out again. Not to return. Not to reconcile. But to redefine the past. She wanted us to be friendly. Co-parents who respect each other. People who could sit in the same room and pretend the damage had been mutual. She said, "I think enough time has passed." I said, "For you, maybe." She didn't like that answer. People who escape consequences hate timelines that don't center them. The last meaningful conversation we had happened outside a school auditorium during a recital. Parents were laughing. Taking pictures. Acting like families. She stood beside me and said, "I hope you know I never meant to hurt you." I looked at the stage where our daughter was lining up, nervous and excited. "I know. There was nothing else." And for the first time, she understood. This wasn't a pause. This was the end. My daughter didn't grow up bitter. She grew up precise. She watches people closely. Notices inconsistencies. Values presence more than promises. She learned early that love isn't what someone says when things are easy. It's who stays when things cost them something. She doesn't talk about her mother much. Not with anger. With distance. And that, I think, is the truest consequence. I didn't rebuild a perfect life. I built a real one. One with boundaries instead of fantasies. One with stability instead of intensity. One where love is shown through consistency, not declarations. The disappearance didn't destroy me. But it permanently changed the shape of my trust. And I'm okay with that. Some scars aren't meant to fade. They're meant to warn. My wife disappeared. 3 weeks later, I found out why. Years later, I understood how. She didn't vanish because she was lost. She vanished because staying would have required her to face who she had become. Some people choose escape. Others choose endurance. That difference doesn't show immediately. But over time, it defines everything. This isn't a story about cheating. It's a story about absence. About how someone can be physically present for years while slowly removing themselves emotionally, until leaving feels inevitable to them, and catastrophic to everyone else. There was no dramatic ending. No redemption arc. Just a quiet permanence. She left. We stayed. And that was the truth that lasted. What stayed with me the longest wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the stillness afterward. The long stretch of time where nothing dramatic happened, but everything had already changed. People expect pain to be loud. They expect crying, shouting, collapse. That happened, sure, but it passed. What replaced it was quieter and heavier. Mornings where I woke up already tired. Evenings where the house felt too large for the number of people in it. Conversations reduced to logistics. Life stripped of assumptions. I learned that when someone disappears the way my wife did, they don't just remove themselves from your present. They retroactively infect your past. Memories lose their stability. Moments you thought were real become suspect. You replay old conversations and realize you were the only one fully there. I used to think we had problems like every couple. Stress. Fatigue. Missed connections. Now I understood those weren't problems. They were symptoms. She had been leaving long before she physically vanished. I just didn't recognize the signs because I believed commitment was mutual by default. After the dust settled, after the legal process slowed down and the routines hardened into habit, I started noticing how often people asked the wrong questions. They wanted to know what she did, how she cheated, how long it lasted, who the other man was. Those details mattered less than people think. The real damage wasn't the affair. It was the disappearance. The deliberate decision to erase herself without explanation, to let everyone else absorb the confusion while she pursued clarity for herself. That kind of choice doesn't come from impulse. It comes from practice. I saw it later, in smaller moments. Missed calls. Broken promises. Half-hearted apologies. She didn't vanish once. She vanished repeatedly, in ways that let her avoid being the villain in her own story. And I stopped trying to correct that story. I learned something important during those years. If someone needs to believe they were justified, they will reshape reality until it fits. You can present facts, timelines, consequences. None of it matters if accountability threatens their self-image. So I stopped arguing with ghosts. What I focused on instead was my daughter. On giving her something solid to stand on. On making sure that while one parent disappeared, the other didn't. That meant consistency even when I was exhausted. Calm even when I was furious. Honesty without cruelty. Protection without poisoning her against her mother. That last part was the hardest. Because it would have been easy to explain everything. To tell her how deeply she'd been betrayed. To let anger justify transparency. But children don't need the full truth. They need stability. They need to believe at least one adult isn't going to vanish when things get uncomfortable. So I stayed. I stayed through the awkward exchanges. Through the holidays that felt wrong. Through the birthdays that arrived without calls. Through the slow realization that my wife wasn't just unreliable, she was optional. And children notice when a parent becomes optional. They don't announce it. They adjust. They lower expectations. They stop reaching. Watching that happen rewired something in me. It removed whatever lingering hope I had that things might someday circle back into something recognizable. They wouldn't. Some endings don't slam shut. They erode. Years passed. Not quickly. Not cleanly. But they passed. My daughter grew taller. More aware. More reserved. She became careful with people in a way that looked like maturity from the outside and caution from the inside. She learned early that love isn't measured by intensity, but by reliability. She learned that from absence. And I learned something too: staying doesn't make you noble. It makes you tired. It makes you patient in ways you didn't ask to be. It forces you to grow muscles you never wanted to need. But it also gives you something rare: a clear conscience. There are nights I replay everything. Not because I miss my wife, but because my brain still wants causality. A moment where I could have changed the outcome. A sentence I should have said differently. A sign I should have noticed sooner. That search never ends well. Some people don't leave because of what you did wrong. They leave because staying would require them to confront who they are. And that's not a confrontation everyone survives. The last time I saw her, really saw her, wasn't dramatic. No argument. No tears. Just two people standing in the same space with completely different emotional timelines. She wanted peace. I already had it. Not the warm kind. The settled kind. The kind that comes from no longer waiting for explanations that will never arrive. She tried to soften the past. To blur responsibility. To frame everything as unfortunate but mutual. I didn't fight her on it. Because the truth doesn't need defense once you've accepted it. What mattered wasn't how she explained herself. What mattered was what she had done, and kept doing. She left. And then she kept leaving. That pattern answered every question I still had. Today, when people hear my story, they expect bitterness. They expect a villain. They expect closure wrapped in forgiveness or revenge. What they get instead is something quieter. Acceptance. Not approval. Not absolution. Acceptance. My life didn't turn out the way I expected. But it didn't collapse either. It narrowed. It sharpened. It became more deliberate. I trust less. But I trust better. I love without illusions. But I love deeply. And my daughter grew up knowing what it looks like when someone stays, even when My wife disappeared. 3 weeks later, I found out why. Years later, I understood what it meant. Some people walk away from families. Others become the reason those families survive. And once that line is crossed, there is no version of the story where everything goes back to how it was. That isn't tragedy. That's reality. And learning to live inside it was the hardest thing I've ever done, and the most honest. There are moments when I realize how completely my sense of time changed after she disappeared. Before, life moved in expectations. Plans. Milestones. We talked in next year, and someday, and when things calmed down. After she left, time flattened. Everything became about now. About what needed to be handled today. What needed to be explained tonight. What couldn't be postponed without consequences. That's one of the things people don't understand about abandonment. It compresses your life. It removes the luxury of long-term thinking. You stop assuming continuity. You stop trusting that the people around you will still be there later. That shift never fully reverses. Even now, years later, I catch myself bracing for absence. When someone doesn't respond to a message quickly, my chest tightens before my mind can intervene. When plans change last minute, I feel the familiar weight of disappointment before logic reminds me that not every delay is a disappearance. Trauma trains you to expect loss. I didn't notice how deeply that training had settled in until I tried dating again. Not seriously. Not at first. Just conversations. Coffee. The polite attempts friends make on your behalf when they decide you've been alone long enough. I realized quickly that I wasn't afraid of intimacy. I was afraid of investment. I could talk. I could laugh. I could listen. But the moment someone hinted at permanence, at future plans, shared routines, emotional reliance, I felt something close inside me. Not panic. Not anger. Just. Because I knew what it costs to build a life with someone who leaves. And I wasn't willing to pay that price again. Some people told me I was being unfair. That not everyone disappears. That I couldn't punish new people for old wounds. They were right. And they were also wrong. Trust isn't a moral obligation. It's a calculation. And my math had changed. What surprised me was how little I missed romantic partnership. I missed companionship sometimes. Shared jokes. Someone else in the room during long evenings. But I didn't miss the vulnerability of intertwining my life so completely with another adult that their choices could detonate everything. I had already lived through that. Once is enough. My daughter, meanwhile, kept growing. quietly, observantly. She became the kind of kid teachers described as self-sufficient and mature for her age. Compliments that sound good until you understand what they usually mean. She learned not to ask for too much. She learned to manage disappointment efficiently. She learned to read emotional temperature before speaking. Those skills kept her safe. They also worried me. I made a point of telling her, often, that she was allowed to need things. That she was allowed to be angry. That disappointment wasn't a failure. But I could see how deeply independence had embedded itself in her personality. How early she learned that relying too much on anyone was risky. That lesson didn't come from me. It came from watching someone leave and never fully return. Her mother tried, occasionally, to bridge the gap. Texts that felt scripted. Apologies that arrived without context. Invitations that were later cancelled due to life getting complicated. Each attempt did more harm than good. Children don't measure love by intention. They measure it by follow-through. And follow-through was never her mother's strength. Eventually, my daughter stopped responding. Not out of spite. Out. She told me once, quietly, "It hurts less when I don't expect anything." That sentence landed harder than any accusation ever could. It wasn't angry. It was practical. And it told me everything I needed to know about the long-term cost of disappearance. I never confronted my ex about that. Not directly. There was no point. She had already demonstrated how she handled uncomfortable truths. She avoided them. She reframed them. She outweighed them. And I refused to spend more of my life chasing accountability from someone who had proven, repeatedly, that she would always choose distance over responsibility. People sometimes ask me if I hate her. I don't. Hate requires emotional proximity. It requires you to stay connected to the person you're resenting. What I feel is closer to disconnection. She exists in my history the way a closed business exists in a neighborhood. You remember it was there. You remember what it used to be. But you don't expect the lights to turn back on. Every now and then, something reminds you of it, a sign that hasn't been taken down, a memory tied to a place, but you keep walking. That's what she became. A former structure. Not a living presence. The strangest part is how normal my life looks now from the outside. School events. Work routines. Grocery lists. Holidays that run on predictable schedules. Nothing about my daily existence suggests the emotional earthquake that reshaped it. And that's how it usually goes. The biggest damage doesn't announce itself. It integrates. It becomes the reason you double-check locks. The reason you plan redundancies. The reason you never assume someone else will handle something important. It becomes the reason you stay. If there's one thing I wish people understood about stories like mine, it's that betrayal isn't defined by the act itself. It's defined by what happens afterward. By who carries the weight. By who adapts. By who absorbs the. My wife disappeared to find herself. I stayed to protect a child. Those choices don't exist on the same moral plane. And over time, they produce very different lives. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I don't tell it to warn people against love. And I don't tell it because I think my experience is unique. I tell it because disappearance is often romanticized. Framed as bravery. As self-discovery. As choosing happiness. But from the other side, from the side that stays, it looks different. It looks like confusion with no answers. Like responsibilities multiplied overnight. Like explaining adult failures to a child who didn't ask for them. It looks like years of quiet recalibration. And it looks like permanence. My wife disappeared. 3 weeks later, I found out why. But the real discovery took years. It was realizing that some people don't leave because they're lost. They leave because staying would require them to become someone better than they're willing to be. And when that happens, the people who stay behind don't just survive. They build. They endure. They become the steady ground others grow from. That's how this ended. Not with closure. Not with reconciliation. but with a life that continued intact because someone chose not to vanish. And that choice mattered more than any explanation ever could. There's a point, years after someone leaves, when you realize the story has stopped evolving. Not because you forgot, but because there's nothing left to discover. No new angles. No hidden explanations waiting to be uncovered. Just the same truth, viewed from different distances. That realization didn't come with relief. It came with clarity. I stopped wondering what would have happened if she'd stayed. I stopped imagining alternate timelines where one conversation changed everything. I stopped negotiating with the past. Not because I forgave her. Because the outcome was inevitable. Looking back, the signs weren't subtle. I just didn't know what I was looking at. I mistook emotional withdrawal for stress. Secrecy for privacy. Distance for independence. I thought love meant giving space, trusting without verification, assuming good intent. What I didn't understand then was that trust without presence isn't trust at all. It's neglect disguised as generosity. When she left, she didn't just exit my life. She exited responsibility. She stepped out of a role she had grown tired of performing and framed it as self-preservation. And for a while, people believed that framing. Some still do. But time has a way of revealing who absorbs the cost of someone else's freedom. It wasn't her. It was the child who waited by the window on scheduled days that quietly dissolved. It was the school forms that listed one reliable parent and one inconsistent signature. It was the holidays recalibrated around absence. It was me, recalculating everything from finances to emotional bandwidth overnight. Freedom isn't free when it's funded by someone else's stability. I learned to live with that imbalance because there was no alternative. You don't get to pause parenthood while someone else figures themselves out. You don't get to opt out of being the anchor just because you're tired. So I became dependable to the point of invisibility. People praised my strength without understanding the cost of it. They said things like, "You're handling it so well," and "Your daughter is lucky to have you," as if those were comforting statements instead of quiet indictments of what she'd lost. I didn't correct them. I didn't want pity. I wanted normalcy. Normalcy, it turns out, is built from repetition. From showing up so consistently that absence stops feeling like an event and starts feeling like a baseline. That's how my daughter survived it. Not through explanations, but through predictability. Dinner at the same time. Homework at the same table. Mornings that didn't change depending on someone else's mood or availability. She didn't need me to be perfect. She needed me to be there. That distinction shaped everything. As she grew older, the questions changed. They became less emotional and more analytical. Less, "Why did she leave?" and more, "How do people do that?" She wasn't asking about her mother anymore. She was asking about human behavior. About how someone can convince themselves that walking away is necessary. About how people justify harm without seeing themselves as harmful. About how responsibility can feel optional to some and non-negotiable to others. Those conversations were sobering. Because I didn't want to teach her cynicism. But I wasn't going to teach her denial either. So I told her the truth in pieces. Carefully. Age-appropriately. Without cruelty, but without fiction. I told her that some people run from discomfort instead of growing through it. That some people prioritize their feelings over their obligations. That those choices don't make them monsters, but they do make them unreliable. And reliability, I told her, is the foundation of love. Not passion. Not promises. Reliability. She absorbed that lesson deeply. I see it in how she chooses friends. In how she pulls back when people flake. In how she values actions over words. Part of me aches knowing where that wisdom came from. Another part of me is proud of how she carries it. I haven't spoken to my ex in years now. Not truly. Messages still arrive occasionally, holidays, milestones, but they're shallow. Polite. Carefully curated. She wants connection without confrontation. I won't give her either. Because there's nothing left to negotiate. Some people mistake silence for bitterness. They assume if you're not engaging, you're still angry. The opposite is true. Silence is what comes after anger burns out. It's what's left when there's no desire to be understood by someone who never listened in the first place. I don't need her to understand the damage she caused. I don't need acknowledgement. I don't need remorse. Those things wouldn't change what happened. And they wouldn't repair what she broke. What repaired it, slowly, imperfectly, was time and consistency and choosing not to disappear myself. That's the part of the story no one romanticizes. Staying is boring. Staying is repetitive. Staying means doing the same things every day without recognition, without applause, without certainty that it will ever feel fair. But staying is also what builds something that lasts. My daughter is grown now. Not fully, no one ever really is, but grown enough to see patterns clearly. Grown enough to make choices based on values instead of fear. She doesn't ask about her mother anymore. Not because she doesn't care. Because she understands. And understanding, I've learned, is sometimes more final than forgiveness. I don't know where my ex ended up. I know pieces. Second-hand updates. Fragments that reach me through people who still think I'm interested. I'm not.